Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be covering these two books from the Dark Elf trilogy, Homeland and Exile. Now, both of these are older printings. The copy I have here is for Homeland is a first printing 1990 copy. The second book, Exile, is also a first printing from 1990. In a previous video, I mentioned that the Orc King I bought during the summer of 2010 when there was a double funeral in the family. I purchased the Orc King at a Goodwill in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and then about a week later, I had finished it, or mostly finished it at the time, and we were cleaning out the apartment of an uncle of mine, my late uncle, and he had died unexpectedly. He didn't have a will put together. He didn't have really as much as he normally would have. He had recently gone through a divorce as well. And it wasn't self-inflicted death. It wasn't suicide. It was a health issue that he had had for a long time that seems to have flared up at a very inopportune moment in our lives. And while we were cleaning out his apartment as a family, I noticed that, there were a lot of things that we needed to figure out. Are they going in storage? Does anyone want them right now? So on and so forth. And there were a lot of books there that were sticking out to me because they had the Forgotten Realms logo on the top. I had just started my entry into reading the Forgotten Realms books with the Orc King, and so I thought, well, I'll take those if no one else wants them. I have these books because of him. And I'm only covering the first two books in this rant because the third in the trilogy is a very different, tonally speaking at least, book. Homeland covers the circumstances of Drizzt Do'Urden's birth and childhood. Drizzt Do'Urden is kind of infamous in certain circles of the Dungeons and Dragons community because in the 90s and early 2000s, when his books were being written, a lot of people came to the tables with characters that were basically just Drizzt Do'Urden. And a lot of the mindset was, why can't you make your own character, something new, something original? Drizzt Do'Urden is the origin of that dual-wielding dark elf who has all this teen wangst, so to speak. All of his background is just edgy in a weird way. And I think a lot of that is overplayed in the community because the books, there is that angst, but it's not as edgy as most people seem to think of it as, or at least it's not as isolated. A lot of these characters that are beloved in some way in the Forgotten Realms in the D&D community are from families that have either, they're either orphans or their families want to kill them, or they're geniuses in some way and they strike out on their own, and because they're unique and have some curse or some or come from some bloodline that is hated by others, they have a struggle about finding acceptance in a wider world. Kelemvor, who eventually became the god of death, kind of has a similar backstory. He has a curse, a family curse, and he is afraid of attachments to people because of how that curse might hurt people around him. And yet he's kind of beloved in the community. Drizzt Do'Urden in Homeland, it goes through his early life. Specifically, in his home city, Menzoberranzan, slavery is commonplace. It's a matriarchal, but in a fetishistic matriarchal society. Women are, the females in the Drow race are bigger and stronger than most men. And so men are kind of a subservient class there, serving only as like middle tier warriors or wizards. Females serve as priestesses of Lolth. That setting is a theocratic city. It is also a matriarchal society. And so Drizzt Do'Urden being born male is about as, not necessarily as low as he could be. He is still a noble, but he is not, his childhood involves a lot of beatings and a lot of abuse because he is male. Eventually, he ends up learning how to fight, this being his basic schooling before he enters the school for young males in the Drow society that are nobles or members of clans and houses that have position within the society of that city. And so he goes to this school and spends 10 years learning how to be a warrior and tactics and all these different things. A lot of it is also indoctrination into the mindset of their society, conditioning him to be a willing participant. And the story kind of implies that very few males, and especially the ones in power, do not fall for that conditioning, but struggle for as much power as they can get in that society. And that means playing along with the conditioning, marching to the beat of someone else's drum. Drizzt Do'Urden is unusual because he is very benevolent. He's a good-hearted kid in an evil society. And so he has this upbringing. He fights it as much as he can, and his refusal to play along, even to act as if he were part of that society, earns him exile. He runs away, and he ends up taking with him a magical artifact that allows him to summon a panther. And that panther, Gwenhwyvar, is his companion throughout all of his books from then on. And so Homeland sets up why Drizzt Do'Urden is the way he is. And it leads into the second book, Exile. Now, in Homeland, he had shown mercy repeatedly to people that he was instructed to kill. A deep gnome he spared and suggested, hey, instead of killing this guy, why don't we just cut off his hands and then let him serve as a warning to the other deep gnomes to never come this close to our city again. And he spins it, or tries to spin it, in a way that may be evil or vindictive, but the deep gnome sees through all that and realizes that this young dark elf is trying to show mercy as best he can. And when they visit the surface and attack some elves during an elven celebration, he spares a young elven girl by splashing some of her mother's blood on her. She would have been his only kill, according to all the other dark elves. And suspicions about the survival of that elf girl lead to that exile as well. And so Exile picks up about a decade after the end of Homeland. He has been living alone in the wilderness of the Underdark for a decade. And according to all of his upbringing, that should be impossible. And so he eventually does seek out people, and he approaches that gnome city, and the gnome that he had spared takes him in as a, not really a slave or indentured servant, but as a friend, but not really a friend. There is a problematic element to their relationship, but he takes mercy on Drizzt. And then eventually, when Drizzt's presence is made known to the Dark Elves, and those who are seeking the bounty on his head come after Drizzt, the deep gnome that he had spared comes with him, and he has a prosthetic on both hands. On one is a hammer, and on the other is a pick. And so he still contributed to his society somewhat, but he was looked on with kind of shame in a way. And so they go out, and this unlikely pair, a deep gnome and a dark elf, try to survive in the wilderness of the Underdark again. Eventually they meet another person, a hook horror, which is a monstrous creature, one of the early Dungeons and Dragons weird minifigure, make this a monster in our game kind of creatures. These creatures are supposed to be unintelligent, and this one seems to be talking. And it turns out it's a Pech. Pech? P-E-C-H. I don't know how to pronounce that word, but it's kind of like a fey creature, a creature of the earth, a creature that is... Their communities are all pacifistic. They just live underground and in harmony with Earth. This Petch is the victim of a wizard that put its mind in a hook horror, a mindless beast's brain. And this Petch is fighting a losing battle. Its mind is slowly turning more and more bestial. This book is, for the most part, a tragedy. Drizzt tries to find home in the Underdark, and everywhere he turns, he is being hunted. He is not welcome with the drow. He is not welcome with the gnomes, and realistically, he doesn't have a stable home in the Underdark. His mother sends a golem made from the body of his father after him, and the father's soul eventually tries to fight that control as best he can. And in the climax of this book, the unthinkable happens, and Drizzt is somehow able to escape. And so he goes to the only exit to the surface that he knows of, which is the exit that he took all those years prior when he spared the elf girl. And so Homeland and Exile are about the childhood and young adulthood of Drizzt Do'Urden and why he can't be at home in the Underdark. The third book, Sojourn, I'll cover in another video because it really is, it's an entirely different experience. It is him finding a home no matter the cost. Sojourn is the third one, I'll cover that. So that is Homeland and Exile. I got these books free. If you find them new, they're kind of worth it. This trilogy is worth it, I think. If you find them used, definitely buy them, especially if you're a fan of the fantasy genre. This one isn't as tacky as the Orc King. It kind of backslid from more mature themes into almost kludgy, hard to take seriously tone. So the Dark Elf trilogy is fun, and it's actually interesting, and yeah, that's what I think about that trilogy. My name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.